The history of the world moves by pendulum. There is progress, which is why we aren't giant toads living in salty tidal pools anymore, but it's nowhere near to a straight path, with countless ups, downs, and countervening directions. History does move in a direction, but I can swear that it's not one that you, or even I, can really understand. One of the modern left's favorite phrases is that they are on the right side of history. However, what if I were to tell you that that wasn't true, that the next 2 decades belong to the very opposite group, the far right? From looking at the patterns in history and trends, I believe that the pendulum will swing back in the other direction for the next few decades. Although I myself am a right-winger, it would be a lie for me to say I'm not terrified for how far the pendulum might go in the other direction. For many of you, this will shatter your conception of the universe, and I'm excited to see what the comments are for this video. Well, why are we wasting time? Let's get started. There's a lot going on in the world right now, and it would be great to try and understand some of it, but it frequently feels difficult to find the time to read or study in daily life. Thankfully, Blinkist has what you need. Blinkist is an app that has over 5,500 nonfiction books and podcasts, making it a great place to start learning about whatever calls you. They have a great selection, and Blinkist is currently offering Blinkist Connect, which allows you to share a premium account with another account with no additional charge, so you can share your interests with a friend or family member. Blinkist is great to listen to on walks or during breaks and is very easy to use and navigate. I recently listened to The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zeihan. You know how much I love Zeihan's work, and how much of an influence he's had on my philosophy and understanding of the world, and you can share that too. Zeihan talks about how the current geopolitical situation and how we are likely to have a major world crisis as driven by demographics and aging, or global supply chain interconnectivity problems. In this fascinating work, he goes through what the world after the crisis may look like, and I highly encourage you to try it out in Blinkist today. A big thanks to Blinkist for sponsoring this video, and for my viewers, Blinkist is offering 25% off Blinkist Premium, so get your account and enjoy 2 memberships for the price of 1. Start your 7-day free trial by clicking the link below, and start learning about whatever interests you. We're all strangers to the world we live in. That's since we're so familiar with our current time that we have no frame of reference for what's strange, wrong, and all that, since we don't know what makes us special. We're fish in a pond that have never seen the outside world, and even more so, the bodies of those fish are mostly made up of water of the pond they live in the same way we make up and cannot be separated from the era of history we live in, the culture we live in, and all that. Thus, it's incredibly funny to see the left portray itself as the rebels and the little guy. Well, in fact, they are the ruling class today. In the modern West, the left is the establishment. You can easily see this in that Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, and Donald Trump have all had legal action taken against them, while there's no left-wing equivalent. In my own story, YouTube has removed my videos on completely innocuous educational topics like American regional cultures or Southeast Asian anthropology, without telling me why. The conservative satire site The Babylon Bee has this really funny segment about how a very large amount of American conservative leaders have been kicked off Twitter, but at the same time, people like Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, lots of officials for the Chinese Communist Party, which is committing genocide, as well as even Vladimir Putin's Russian government Twitter account have maintained, showing a clear ideological bias. The dominant social institutions of academia, the media, Hollywood, most of the news, the bureaucracy, large parts of social media, growing parts of the military, the largest corporations and defense contractors, significant parts of religious institutions, in the United States, the presidency, and large parts of the legislature are run by left-wingers, and often very radical ones at that. Although the right occasionally wins elections, the left runs every major institution in society. The quote-unquote rebels and oppressed now run society. As befits an old entrenched elite, they crack down on dissent and try to spread their ideology. They have tried to turn every movie, TV show, all art, classes in school and university, and every other output for human thought into their propaganda. If you can't see this already, you don't want to see it, or you're old enough to be detached from the main part of the society. As said before, they silence those that disagree with them and have ever-increasing standards of purity used to instill fanaticism in their ranks. This has been the way the world has been since the 1960s, and people often don't realize how much of a shift it's been. Our society had a series of massive social shifts that occurred in the 1960s, which I think are on the same degree as the rise of Christianity, Islam, or a major world religion. This include trying to push for total male and female social equality, the decoupling of sex from baby making and leading to free love, the idea of complete racial and ethnic equality, that war is inherently immoral, as is empire building, that all people are equally intelligent and we just need better socializing to create a utopia. This is a big difference in the idea of equity, or equal outcomes, and equality, or legal equality. The sheer demographic power of the baby boomer generation, which in Western countries grew up in the easiest era in history ever, as I talk about in this video, has meant that the 1960s cultural norms have been pushed ever since, and now have reached the point of absurdity. The message that the baby boomers pushed is that judging someone else is the worst thing a person can do, and that humanity is inherently good, both of which anyone who has studied human nature or the historic record can see as a complete lie. However, since the post-war era was so wealthy, there is no pressure towards telling the truth or having a realistic appraisal of reality, and so people believed what they wanted to believe. Our sense of time is kind of warped today. It's easy for people my age to forget the 60s are still in living memory, and the norm in history is for trends to play out over centuries. Thus, we would only start to see the negative cultural results of choices made in the 60s today, since only now we're seeing the people who remember the pre-60s social order dying off. Coding, in my opinion, is really character building, since a single error in the code's logic throws the whole code off. It teaches discipline and focus, and people often fail to realize that the real world is often pretty similar. A car needs so many things to work, and a single error can keep it from functioning. Societies are the same, in that a single problem, like a failed military, a terrible economy, a religion that's not compelling, and many more, can doom a society to failure. The way healthy societies view the world is that their traditions are almost like a castle against the chaos of the world. Almost everything new that's attempted fails, and traditions and evolutionary processes mean we can pull on billions of years of our ancestors who have been trying to figure out how to make things work. The problem with most societies is they're incapable of changing out their traditions, dooming their societies to fossilization. However, the most successful cultures, for example the West, are able to keep their core identities and then develop institutions like democracies or markets that gradually change out traditions as the world changes so they can keep their vigor as the world keeps changing around them. However, as Thomas Sowell has put it, the left has an open view of the world, or that humans are perfectible and can be trained to turn the world into a utopia. They hold that if there's a disparity in the world, it must stem from someone's conscious judgment. The reality of the world is that inequality is the norm, and stems from a variety of reasons, whether geographic, historical, cultural, and so forth. However, the left thinks the only cause of any kind of disparity is someone oppressing someone else. This may sound silly when put in these terms, but it's an incredibly enticing view of the world, since it paints the liberators as heroes and abdicates them from any self-reflection and responsibility, since they're the good people who are saving the world. A reasonable person looks at the historic record and uses it to project the future, since the past is the only thing we have, and thus it's the best thing we have to understand the future. This isn't controversial in the sciences, but is in the social sciences and humanities. This is since leftists would like to project their religious view of infinite progress that will give them more power, or the moral arc of history. In effect, they are substituting a serious study in exchange for a fantasy. However, the changes that have been made since the 60s presupposes a series of assumptions about the world that have never been tested or evaluated. Those that men and women can healthily have the same social roles, that the people pushing these agendas are wise and capable, that there are not long-standing reasons that different ethnicities have different results, that society's structure itself is evil. Pushing this many changes upon a society this fast is not reform, it's suicide. And the people pushing this even say their goal is the complete destruction of the previous society. However, they fail to tell us what plans they have to replace it, only criticizing the previous culture. However, since their plan has no clear direction, We need them to lead us through this plan. This plan is exactly what the Soviet expert whose job was to destroy non-communist societies, Yuri Bezmenov, said the leftist scheme was. The reality of history is that it bounces back and forth. An empire rises, then falls into barbarism, then 400 years later, a scholar uncovers ancient scrolls that allow a renaissance. Sometimes society becomes more liberal, then religious fanaticism rolls over the society when things get more chaotic. History generally does trend towards greater complexity and advancement, but it's unclear if it will do that over the next 1,000 years or if we're facing another dark age. However, an order based on rebelling against non-order cannot survive. What was harmless rebellion among teenagers in the 50s has now become an all-consuming vortex. The left's lack of sense of stability dooms their movement. I've spent this video so far ripping into the left, but as this video will show, I am long-term more worried at the reaction that could come from this. The left is so detached from reality that it cannot win, as we'll see, but its resentful reaction could be very effective. Politics at its core is the art of building coalitions of separate interest groups and incentivizing them to follow you and listen to your agenda. However, the modern left-wing order strategy has been trying to build the worst coalition possible, or the coalition of losers. We're going to look at the social incentives provided by both the left and the right-wing's coalitions as keys to seeing the future. You need to view our current era, or that stemming back to World War II, as a conscious reaction to World War II. The current ruling class is trying to be the exact opposite of the Nazis. Where the Nazis were nationalistic, masculine, militaristic, racist, and traditional, the modern left is transnational, feminine, pacifist, toxically anti-racist, and progressive. With the decline of Christianity, which pushed intellectual humility, we didn't think further than, let's just do the opposite of the Nazis since they're evil. Also, Marxists purposely twisted this for their own benefit. The modern West hates men, its dominant ethnicities, tradition, force, and all that. However, the problem with building a coalition of everyone who wasn't part of the previous coalition of power is that it just doesn't make sense. There are often long-standing historic reasons why the dominant ethnic group, men and all that, are the ones in charge. If you have a country like America and you want it to function, you can't flagellate white people for practicality's sake since they're 3/4 of the population. Well, if we're being really brutal, America has flourished while being incredibly cruel to black people, which are only 12% of the population. The reason I went through that long segment earlier on trying to explain the left's worldview is that you can only understand how they are this bad at coalition building and having a coherent strategy through understanding how their worldview thinks having a completely idealistic scheme would work. The left's coalition is that between the government, Marxists, women, and ethnic or sexual minorities, including immigrants, largely against white men and the traditions of the society. As said before, the problem with the left's coalition is that it's literally designed off groups that have failed to end up in the ruling coalition. Let's take ethnic minorities. Asians and Hispanics largely want to assimilate into white America, and the track record for former slave black populations gaining power is Liberia and Haiti, both of which are failed states that practice slavery, largely since they gained none of the skills needed for leadership due to centuries of oppression. For women, they're absolutely wonderful as individuals and a big reason to keep living as a man, and they also form the bedrock of society. However, women have absolutely no track record for forming large groups. All of society's major institutions, whether militaries, governments, religions, corporations, have been founded across world history and almost entirely staffed by men. Even nunneries and brothels, entirely female organizations, are run by men. If this was a cultural thing, not a biological, it would fluctuate around world history, but it doesn't. Due to never having to evolve to hunt as a group, women do not have the same instinct towards cooperation that men do. Most really pretty girls have been horribly bullied in high school, and most of their friends are guys, since women tear down successful or beautiful women, since their sexual competition is largely zero-sum, while men are sexually rewarded by being what amounts to successful hunters and bringing stuff for the whole community. Studies show women are just as aggressive as men, and they compete through relationships using something my friend Kurt Doolittle refers to as GSR, or gossiping, shaming, and rallying. When you look at cancel culture, how social justice pushes shaming to reach its goals, it's feminine aggression. Likewise, since women have been protected by men from the harshest parts of nature, like war, animals, forest fires, or the jungle, social justice can afford to be idealistic. The reason the left is so scared of physical force, saying wars, the police, or even spanking children is wrong, is that GSR simply cannot compete with men's physical force. As a general rule, any man who doesn't hate himself loves women as a species. Women have largely escaped the horrors of their own female cooperation by seducing men and forming families, in which they can use their sex as leverage against a single man, rather than trying to fight a social institution in which they as individuals have no leverage. If you were to see a GSR-based movement, it would have two separate things. The first is that it would despise families and the sexes getting along, because that's normally what happens in society, where the sexes pair off and start families, and modern social justice thinks being a mother is the worst thing a woman can do because it would in effect pull a woman away from fighting against men for the goals of the movement and make her just a member of society. And the second thing is that you would see a vicious undercurrent against successful women, and we see that with the body positivity movement, where it's fundamentally a matter of personal responsibility to keep a healthy weight, but this movement talks about pretty privilege and says you cannot be judged for being overweight and unattractive. The third big group is the state. A group requires leadership, and in a healthy society, the leadership serves the people, but in many cases over history, that state has enslaved and even cannibalized its own populations. One of the books that was able to predict the current political divide was Leviathan and Its Enemies. It talks about the current ruling class, who unironically are taught through a leftist or Marxist philosophic prism, use the downtrodden and oppressed as an excuse to push the bureaucracy and the college-educated into every facet of life. As I've said before in my previous videos, all of the left's policies push things that give the college-educated influence and power in society, while the right tries to benefit those who do not base their power off college degrees. The state and educated push all these oppressed groups at the expense of the dominant culture, since the dominant culture in Western countries has lots of social protections, called freedoms and checks and balances, that could curtail their desire to save the world. This may sound unbelievably cynical, but it is literally what the Frankfurt School, which modern leftism is based off, says their plan is. I really love the metaphor of the Leviathan, since it's a reference to Hobbes's famous 17th century book Leviathan, which, in my opinion, correctly posits the argument the state prevents mass violence and oppression. However, a big difference between the world that Hobbes wrote that in 400 years ago and today is that the state was so weak to barely function back then, so its growth was largely at the expense of bandits, pirates, oppressive local nobilities, and all that. However, starting in the 20th century, the state became so powerful as to strangle societies. However, the left uses the same justification as the Leviathan, bringing government into every aspect of life in order to protect people, and makes things fair. The Leviathan is an even better metaphor, since it's a reference to the sea monster from the Bible. In the cultural context that the Bible was written in, the Leviathan, and even more directly, the Mesopotamian Tiamat it's very clearly based off, is the symbol of the force of feminine chaos in the universe. And I mean, fuck it, the left even uses demonic imagery to describe itself at this point. That doesn't get more chaos than that. And in the same way as Tiamat and Leviathan were killed by the masculine god of the coherent strategy and written word, you will see a rebellion by young men kill the Leviathan. There's an African saying that goes, if you don't give the young men a place in the village, they will burn it down to feel its warmth. The Leviathan's coalition has made a couple completely fatal errors, which doom them over the next few decades. One of the two largest is that it simply provides no incentive for young men, who form the gas that powers a society, to work inside the system and not rebel against it. The paradox inside young men is that they are simultaneously by far the most powerful force in society, but they're also incredibly insecure. Young men are the demographic that wages war, explores, builds, does the vast majority of scientific or philosophic breakthroughs, is the major driving force behind the economy in both hours worked and in trying and discovering new things. Young men are the force that just pushes society forwards, and once societies start to age and lose young men, like Japan or Europe, they just stop doing anything new and decay. Young men are quite insecure because they're society's foot soldiers, and they're willing to do that in exchange for being a hero or getting a beautiful wife. However, this makes them extremely sensitive to political changes because it could kill them, and that's why the audience for this YouTube channel is so heavily young men. You have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors for a reason. A healthy society feeds young men stories of heroism in order for role models, gives them apprenticeships with older men who teach them useful skills to become stakeholders, and marries them off young. However, modern societies give young men absolutely no incentive to work with them. The economy is terrible, with social mobility collapsing with no direction forward for most young people. The media hates masculinity, refusing to put out any content with male role models. Society pushes subservience and docility ever since childhood. The educational system, which provides socialization, is incredibly feminized. I remember when I was 10, I drew pictures of swords in my free time and I talked about battle and knights. And my parents were called in because they were worried I might become a school shooter. And that's just normal stuff guys do. If you look at sex, this picture's even more horrifying. Male virginity, for a series of reasons I tackle in this video, has quadrupled in the last 10 years. For the first time, a majority of people at age 30 are single and childless. I consider myself a decently connected and social guy. And of the 50 most handsome, charismatic, and successful guys I know, and this includes CEOs, influencers, and all that, about 3 are in relationships. Large groups of sexually frustrated young men are an incredibly good predictor of political violence. For some reference against the historic standard, in most cultures in the world, the young are married off at a young age by their parents, and the wives are basically slaves to their husbands. This isn't an especially good sexual orientation, but the fact that it's the historical and social norm around most of the world even today shows how keeping the number of sexually frustrated young men down and incentivizing them to work in society by having kids is so important. The sad truth is that women have been horribly oppressed by men over history, since societies are incentivized to sacrifice women to get men to work harder. This breaks down even more with the high divorce rate. Men work hard with the knowledge that they can get married and thus pass on their genes. However, with no-fault divorce, 40% of marriages fail, which is initiated in 70% of cases by women, and among the college-educated, 90% among women. It's normal for a woman to walk away with the kids and a majority of a man's money. Marriage is the foundation of every society ever, and in the modern context, there's absolutely no incentive for a man to get married and have children, since he can lose everything for having done nothing wrong. Modern society shames young men for having done nothing wrong, rather imagined crimes committed by their ancestors. Young men are wired to look for female approval genetically to breed, and so having female disapproval scream at them will cause immense resentment. The feeling among young men that's not unwarranted is that they're in a losing game where no matter what they do, they fail. They have no direction forward or male role models, meaning in the really hard times we live in, which is why figures like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson are so successful. However, the Leviathans coalition is held together at the expense of young men. Thus, it cannot let up and give young men a bone. Also, like the creature it's named after, without belief in any kind of structure or strategy, the Leviathan pushes onwards inchoately. The Leviathan knows subconsciously that a young male rebellion is in the works, which is why it cracked down on Tate so harshly, since he had become a rallying cry that could be used against them. Peterson's demonized, except most of his philosophy is just telling young people to be responsible, and even his anti-trans takes would have been normal 10 years ago. I'm often called a Nazi or far-right, even though I'm one of the very few people in the public sphere who actually talks about how other cultures and anthropology works. The thing with the Leviathans coalition is that it's terrified of using physical force, having to rely upon GSR or gossiping, shaming, and rallying. That means that it actually has no real power, for as Mao Zedong said, power comes from the muzzle of a gun. When a society doesn't have the ability to actually use military force, it gets conquered. When young men get to the point where they are tired of the system, they have the veto power where the Leviathan can't really do anything. They can shame at the top of their lungs, but we're getting to the point where young men have nothing to lose socially and lots to gain by killing the Leviathan. You can sense the rightward tilt in just the social air among young men. It's going to take years to play out, but for so many young men that were just normal people, voted Democrat or Labor, been feminists and all that, they're listening to right-wingers since the left provides them absolutely no incentive, and they're drifting further and further to the right. It's normally a little bit beneath the radar, where these young guys won't say it openly, but once they're allowed to think or speak freely, you'll hear it come out. Left-wingers fail to realize that the only reason the far right would seize power is because of them. There will be a tipping point in which the consensus changes. The thing with GSR is it's almost a form of magic, in which its only power comes from people believing it has power. This is the movement that will not evict the homeless from city centers or prevent criminals from violating property rights, let alone violently maintaining its power. The Leviathan is a giant deck of cards. The social order it's pushed since World War II has resulted in collapsing birth rates, which will kill the economies of every major country in the world, except America or India. Areas that are really going to get affected hard are China, Russia, Japan, or Europe. In America, we're still going to see a lot of aging. However, the breaking of societies that will come from this, where there are two 70-year-olds for each 25-year-old, will result in mass social changes towards family values and conservatism, so this traumatic event never happens again. A collapsing birth rate is the death of the feminist movement. It simply cannot survive this existential threat. If collapsing birth rates are destroying society, people aren't going to say, it's your choice whether or not you have children, you don't need a partner. They'll say, get a fucking partner and start pumping out kids. Women now support the Leviathan since they believe it will help them. However, once the current generation of women realizes they are slated for deaths as lonely spinsters, which disincentivizes men from marrying them through the current divorce laws, you'll suddenly hear them change their tune. So many girls who are very proud in their 22 suddenly wish they had traded in their looks for a match earlier when their 34 or 40-year-olds divorcing think they'll have the same options as when they got married in their 20s. Remember, the Leviathan is incentivized to keep women lonely and angry since that's when they're the best foot soldiers. If the current trends continue, nearly half of women in their 20s will end up being unmarried, and a large part of that childless. Also, in America at least, one of the Leviathan's biggest weaknesses are that most minorities, such as Hispanics and Asians, would rather assimilate into the broader white society, which is why they immigrated to America in the first place, than push being victims, which black people, who are only 12% of the population, can do convincingly, since they do have a long history of repression. Also, Hispanic and Asian young men have many of the same grievances against the Leviathan as young men. Likewise, older men will likely side with young men unless they are direct stakeholders in the previous order, seeing the current order as unsustainable since it so clearly hates masculinity. The leadership in corporations largely does not care about wokeness, it's just the bureaucratic staff they have to hire to run their corporations is, and it's the cultural norm being pushed now that you get pushback for going against. Wokeness hurts corporate performances, as we've plainly seen with Disney as a great example. And so the market has to readjust, or these broken organizations will be replaced by newer, more vigorous ones. This shift in consensus has to occur over the next few decades for the reasons I've explained before. As I've explained in this video, I will be surprised if it's directly violent or an actual war, since the Leviathan is totally unwilling to use physical force. As I have said before, I'm more worried at the reaction than the Leviathan itself. The Leviathan is fundamentally delusional and weak. Its only damage can come from destroying pre-existing social units rather than actively building itself. However, angry white men have an extremely good track record at being very good at being cruel for long periods of time, since it's realistic, organized, and effective. One of the things that worries me is a combination of the looming financial crisis that will crush many young people's already not great standards of living, thus further radicalizing them with nothing to lose. The Leviathan pays absolutely no attention to class issues, ironically, and in fact has buy-in from major corporations, meaning these economic problems will end up being co-opted by the far right. It's kind of funny in that the right has traditionally been seen as the party of the wealthy and business interests, but similarly to Nazi Germany, where the Nazis positioned themselves as the party of the working German man who could supply family, stability, work, and having a normal life, the right can co-opt this because the left has become the party of the ruling class. And so a narrative we've seen a lot in the new right, because it might be true, is the World Economic Forum globalist elites are trying to crush the local working classes. As I've talked about before in previous videos, I think that America and Europe will have a major political crisis over the next 2 decades. However, I'm not going to go into as much detail about this in this video, just because I've done so many hours before about it. But long story short, you can look at these various patterns to predict political and social crises, and the Western world has all of them. In the same way the baby boomer generation was able to dominate politics and society for over 60 years, my age group, or Gen Z, is the last big generation in America, and so you would expect us to also have a disproportionate influence over the next couple decades. And if you look across Western history, you tend to see patterns of around 60 to 80 years of pushing a certain cultural trend, often in backlash to a previous one. There are two separate kinds of conservative revolution. The first is a more limited one, in which the conservatives are able to seize power for a few decades due to a major mistake the left has made. However, the left still has the greater amount of cultural vigor and wins in the end. You saw this happen in Latin America a lot over the 20th century, as well as Central Europe in the 20th century. In this first scenario, we see something that Carroll Quigley, who is possibly the greatest historian of the last century, talks about, in that the West has had alternating periods between 50 to 100 years over the last 500 years of pushing ideologies that are either order or chaos-based, where the Renaissance was about humanism and art and all that that's very intuitive. After it came the Reformation that was very socially conservative and built around trying to fix people up for God better. And another example being the Enlightenment, which was all about trying to rationally improve society, followed by the Romantic period that had both very extreme, emotional, powerful movements on both the right and the left. And here's a text wall to go through this process. But social justice is possibly the biggest attempt at Western social engineering so far, or the order side. It's so much order, in fact, that it's failed and become a beast of chaos. And in reaction, you would see a more human, religious, intuitive philosophy that would probably exist as a reaction against how digitized and mechanical our lives are with the computer revolution. The German philosopher Hegel, although I really dislike a lot of his work, has an interesting point of a synthesis and an antithesis, where a society pushes a certain idea, then it pushes the opposite one, and then it finds what are the good points shared between both of them. And you can see this in Western history, where often the reaction to the previous era is what the current era is about, with the Enlightenment being rationality, the Romantic era being emotionality, the Renaissance being the Greco-Roman heritage of Western civilization, the Reformation being the Christian Germanic barbarian. Writing in the 60s, Carroll Quigley called the post-World War II era the era of social justice. And it's fundamentally the West's period of the most social engineering ever. And it's so based around rigid ideological structures, or the search for order, that it in fact has the opposite effect and becomes a beast of chaos. Also, if you look to the rise of the Nazi movement, and as I talk about in my video Disgust promulgates right-wing authoritarianism, and our current society, and especially the left, is pushing massive amounts of behavior that just disgust normal people. Sam Smith's latest performance at the Grammys, and the fact that it was supported by the establishment, shows this. And so, as much as the left pushes, let's say, drag shows or things that the normal person finds disgusting, they can expect a horrible reaction similar to Nazi Germany's reaction to the Weimar period. So the first situation, or the one I described before, is a conservative victory lasting around 80 years. The second one is that someone just straight up founds a new religion, strong sect of Christianity, or philosophy that acts as a religion. Across history, every religion has been a conservative revolution, where Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Confucius all did not view themselves as founding religions, but as fixing the previous religious teachings of their earlier society and finding something immutably ancient and true. And the thing is, conservative religious revolutions last for thousands of years, and an example of this is how the Hindu Brahmins were able to beat out the new Buddhists in 3rd century India. Another is the early Christians taking over the Roman Empire and establishing a more conservative philosophy that kept going for thousands of years. As I talk about in my video on the internet, I think this is actually decently plausible, because our society lacks any real unifying values. So there's a giant pressure towards a new religious formation, and on top of that, the internet allows mass preaching to go around the world instantly, thus creating a new avenue for it. If you look at Spengler's theory of history, the West is currently in the era of Caesarism, and it's a pretty common pattern, actually, when societies try to adopt a different religion during Caesarism and the start of the Universal Empire, and then reject it later on and return to what they had before. You saw this in China, which tried to take Buddhism and then reverted back to Confucianism. In India, which tried Buddhism as well and then went back to Hinduism. In the Middle Eastern world, they tried Christianity for a few centuries and then reverted back to Islam, which is much more similar to the previous tribal religions they had. And in the West, we're trying Marxism for a few centuries. And then there's a pretty good shot from the precedent of us returning to Christianity. I mean, there has to be a new ideology just because the old ones cannot deal with the modern world well enough. Imagine forming just a legit straight-up fascist country today, or a straight-up Stalinist country. That's played out, and you always see changes in how conservative or progressive ideas manifest, where no one could have predicted the Nazi movement in 1900, and they might have predicted there would be a conservative movement, and probably a racist one at that, but not exactly what it was. If whatever ideology comes out of this is poorly designed, it won't be able to garner long-term support, but if it's well-designed, it'll take over and become the cultural context for centuries. The second point is that we've seen further and further radicalization on the right, just in the last decade or so. A large factor is the Leviathan keeps on trying to purge figures that rise to leadership, thus incentivizing even more radical people to rise to leadership since they have no incentive to be moderate. Look at how Trump, Peterson, and Tate have all had legal action done against them and been canceled. The steam valve has to release, and the less inches the left gives, the more insane the reaction's going to be. Also, even incredibly moderate people get called the worst names like Nazis, so radicalism on the right has been boy who calls wolfed by the left. I mean, let's just stop for a second and remember that George W. Bush was called a Nazi. What will the ideology of this new right look like? I'm not going to talk about Europe here just because that's a whole different can of worms, but I think they will have their own right-wing reaction, which I talk about in my video on Europe. It's interesting to see this play out in real time because I've been predicting what the future of the right might be for years, and as a person who's literally on ground zero seeing this develop, it's fascinating to see what predictions play out. And the top thing that I've seen is that this new right will use Christianity as its dominant ideology and centralizing force. As an insider to the internet right-wing world, it's crazy to see how much more conservative the right has gotten in just the last couple years. As just a joke on my Twitter, I said, at this rate, the right's going to start proposing witch burning soon. And about half of my followers said, hell yeah. If the left didn't want to get burnt, they shouldn't act like Satanists. And that's not a good sign. I'm scared since you're taking young men, the most aggressive demographic in society, and then massively poking their buttons genetically where they were designed to have the most rage, and then not expecting a bad response. At the same time, our society has thrown away a lot of its powerful value structures that it would use as a way of a moderating force against really horrible actions. You've seen Christianity become a much bigger motivator in the modern right, more so than economics, and I know so many people on the right who have become significantly more religious in the last couple years, and my guess is that this is largely since social justice and COVID are just so chaotic that people are looking to the religion of their ancestors to provide some degree of psychological stability. There are 4 separate factions on the right, which I will break down as the snake, the lobster, the frog, and the cross. With the snake, that's libertarians and business conservatives, and they're a very big faction. However, they don't have a shared unifying ideology that will make their young men willing to fight and die for them very strongly, so they'll just become part of another coalition. With the lobster, that's Jordan Peterson and his centrist Christianity, which is much more palatable for a secular audience. And either you will see a more centrist Christianity develop, or you will see a more far-right Christianity. If it manifests with centrist leadership, it will be under an ideology that was invented by Jordan Peterson, even if he might not be the ultimate leading figure, or it'll be someone who comes after Jordan Peterson. Then you have the red pill, which is like 4chan and Andrew Tate, and will have a tremendous amount of supporters due to sexually frustrated young men. However, it's too cynical to actually form an ideology around, and so it'll be part of the ruling coalition, but not its leader. Then you have the hard Christian right, which I think has an equal shot of seizing control of the coalition as the Petersonians, and fundamentally, it will be a battle between fundamentalists and the Petersonians for the right. I'm going to make a best and worst case scenario here, both of which I think are plausible, and then through discovering these two separate trajectories, we can try to figure out what the right can do in order to not completely dishonor itself. In most religions in world history, the dominant principle and thing humans can use to bring out goodness against the chaos of the world is conscious thought. Because without conscious thought, we're slave to our emotions and passions, but with it we can plan around them and then be able to form some kind of order. And the worst position for the right would be it just naturally forming raw chaos without a coherent single ideology and just acting in a vindictive way against everyone it feels wrong against, because if it has a coherent ideology, it can actually hold itself to a moral standard. I mean, an example of this going wrong is the Nazis. The Nazis had no moral standards for themselves and just behaved in the worst way possible out of a feeling of disgust and revenge. There are two things I find worrying. The first is the right's anti-intellectual culture, which makes the rise of a coherent theory of the world that the right could use to find moral standards seem not that great, and also in the previous precedents for conflicts like civil wars, it's normally the most radical faction that wins. And so from that, you would see a highly ethnocentric, aggressive, religious, fanatical faction. You need to have a balance of faith and reason, where faith pushes your soul and gives you the inspiration in the generally good direction, while reason can balance it and temper it with the real outside world. And I worry that a religious fanatical right would lose all reason, because fanatics often win civil wars because they have the highest amount of in-group loyalty, but also they're just not good at understanding how the world really works. And I worry that if fanatics seize control of America, they might hurt genuine religion through making it look corrupt and decadent. And you see this with the Ayatollahs in Iran, you see it with Franco in Spain, the Argentinian and Chilean. It's a pretty common pattern in which religious fanatics seize political power, make the religion itself look corrupt, and then end up making the society far more secular. You need to temper faith with rationality, because that's the only way to keep it real and stay reasonable. Faith can nourish your soul, but at the same time, you need to have rational feedback with the rest of the world. America, even if it becomes a Christian-run nation, still has lots of atheists and agnostics, and you need their buy-in into the system. A couple videos ago, I had a video comparing the often insane similarities between Rome and America. And if we're looking at that whole comparison, we would be entering the Augustan age pretty soon. And that was when Roman religious conservatives seized control of the society and tried to shove socially conservative legislation, especially aimed at raking the birth rate down the population's throat, but it was just not effective because the population was so secularized that it couldn't go back. The Swiss psychologist and philosopher Carl Jung talked of the Odin switch, or how in Germanic peoples they're normally very law-abiding and orderly, but when they really get pushed, they can go full psycho and return to barbarism. And you saw this with the Nazis, where the Germans are normally a very orderly people, and then they just went full barbarian. And I worry the same thing with the modern American right, where America is still a heavily culturally and genetically Germanic country, so that instinct is still there. And with the left, they act like a woman who is badgering her husband to make her husband retaliate, and the right does not work in increment like the left. It takes a giant switch. And so I'm worried at a point where the right just goes full barbaric to take revenge against the decades of humiliations by the left. In fact, the only way the left could possibly win the culture wars is because the right has such a quick jump from being passive to being extremely aggressive, and the left meanwhile gradually builds up towards more and more aggression, would be for the left to goad the right into a direct rebellion, thus forcing the army, which normally tilts right, but will follow the government and follow orders, to crush the right-wing rebels, thus painting the right as traitors. And we all like to forget this happened on the right, but we have to remember January 6th happened. And January 6th happened before whatever recession and other political problems are going to happen over the next couple years. So if that's the baseline, what could happen next? And I'm worried about some ridiculously retarded actions on the right, like that or launching rebellions that will make the right seem terrifying and radical to normal American people. Well, the reality is the right just needs to stay still, keep its values, and then the left in the Leviathan will gradually decompose, thus leaving a more moderate right in power. So the right needs to hold on to its feelings. And I would just say, for the love of God, people listening on the right, do not launch a rebellion. Also, the left is much better at branding, so if the right does something radical, the left will immediately shame the right for it, and the right will face greater consequences for doing something insane than the left will, because the left is much more smooth at delivery, while the things the right does are more likely to come across as cringe. Conspiracy theories are in some ways the ultimate point of faith over reason, in that you're not following basic logic, but instead you're saying my worldview must be correct, so I'll have all these bizarre inconsistencies to build up a worldview that aligns with what I believe to be true with my faith. And you know your movement is not doing the right thing when you have conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories allow you to just totally ignore the truth. And once you're ignoring the truth, it cuts yourself off from any stabilizing foundation. You're already seeing the right push conspiracy theories in a really big way, where, just as an example, President Trump and Fox News were pushing the conspiracy theory that the election was faked, which had no evidence. I mean, the right has Congress people like Paul Gosar or Marjorie Taylor Greene that push legitimate conspiracy theories, and said January 6th and the rebellion was good, and on top of that, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, have relationships with literal white supremacists like Nick Fuentes, and the Republican Party's reaction to January 6th, or a storming of the Capitol, was half-heartedly negative at best. As I talked about earlier, there are very stark comparisons now between America and the fall of the late Roman Republic, and in the cycle of civilizations, us and Rome are in the same place. And what happened in Rome? A right-wing Caesar arrived, thus ending the Republic. And I worry that the same thing might happen to us, and it's no surprise that our democratic institutions have grown much weaker, and Trump, even though he had many good qualities, was a populist strongman who contested the election. I think the chances of women's rights being wiped out are decently high. The new right might say things like this: women were most unhappy when they had rights. We gave them everything, and they asked for even more. Or the birth rate collapsed so much so that society could no longer function. As said before, young men look for female approval, and so having a dating market this abysmal, combined with every outlet in society hating masculinity, will probably push a vociferous and incredibly angry reaction. Modern feminism doesn't seem to realize how lucky women are for the rights they have now, and basically no other era in history ever had women's rights. And I'm just shocked in some ways looking at it, because I'm thinking, it looks as if you're trying to goad men to wipe out your rights by just being as annoying as possible. And I don't think that's the intention, but that's what it looks like sometimes. Feminists must realize that men hold all the cards of actual physical force in society, and historically the way women have gotten things from men is by seducing them and making the men fall in love with them and then giving them whatever they want. Because whenever women try to compete directly with men, they have to lose, and I don't know why modern feminism doesn't understand that. I don't think the future right is going to be very racist. And if you look at right-wing platforms today, they often have lots of people of color. Lots of the very most right-wing people I know are ethnic minorities, and most of the most right-wing guys I know are dating Asian or Hispanic women because they're more traditional. However, I do see a great degree of misogyny on the right that is developing, as an entire generation of young men have been vilified by women and are sexually frustrated due to the dating crisis. As Nietzsche once said, "Battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster, and if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you." I worry that the right will throw away everything that it used to stand for in order to win this conflict. In these last two recent videos, I've talked about how some of the variables stand out for us to have the rise of Caesarism, or for us to lose the Republic. If we want to look to the Romans, their conservative backlash in the late Republic, which is the best parallel to our current era, was able to stabilize things. However, it was at the expense of their freedoms and everything that made them great. However, the same choice stares us down now. I trust the leaders of whatever movement concentrated among young men are currently watching this video. Listen to my words carefully. You can either succumb to our emotions for no real gain and lose everything we care about. Alternately, no matter how hard it feels, we can think about the things that matter to us and stand for them. Let's not burn our village down to feel its warmth. We might need the houses at some point. What can people on the right do to prevent this horrible reaction and get the best one that I think we can achieve? It's having something that we actively believe in rather than just hating the left. Hatred can only destroy. However, if you have something that you positively believe in, you can build something new. Values like the truth, which keeps you from being completely unmoored from reality. Values like humility, which prevent you from doing something insanely stupid because you're on an ego trip. And the right needs to dig deep to figure out what values it actively does believe in. And we have to protect our freedoms and protect that America has always been a country where people of differing ideas and backgrounds have been able to live and share together ever since our foundation. One of the best case scenarios is some kind of broad-thinking New Deal scenario, where we have a forward-thinking conservative president who's able to build a coalition together of both people on the right and moderates and even some leftists. This would be a leader of Roosevelt or Lincoln's caliber who can bring America through this turbulent period while maintaining the republic and our heritage and values. I think this scenario is plausible because the most radical factions of the right weren't able to win a severe victory in the midterms, thus meaning the Republican Party is now having a crisis of leadership in which effective and good leadership can rise to the top. America's problems are not that fundamental. Long story short, our economy will probably be in very good shape in a couple decades, and as long as we don't lose the things that matter to us right now, we have very good foundations as a country. A problem with modern American conservatives is that they're too reactive, in that they spend all their time trying to stop what the left is currently doing. Well, the left has a very active moral center, that being diversity and inclusion, and that whole woke prism. You know when you drank way too much and then your friends asked you why you'd said all that retarded shit, or like why you were hitting on a girl that's actually a solid 3, and you think, holy shit, like, I shouldn't have drunk that much. That's the equivalent of what the conservative movement could do, except the stakes are much higher. Let's not have as many drinks, and let's keep responsible friends around us as we're drinking.